Blue Ridge, Virginia, 1925, Essie, Bessie, and Dessie, three sisters whose names would later echo through whispers, legends, and reports, stepped out of their small wooden home on the edge of the mountains. The early morning fog curling around the trees like pale fingers. Birds fell silent as though sensing the weight of what was to come. The creek nearby shimmered in the weak light of the rising sun, reflecting more than just the forest around it. No one in Ravenswood noticed at first. No one would later admit that something unseen had watched them, had waited. The sisters carried baskets of laundry, the fabric swaying softly as they walked. Their laughter echoed faintly, but it was laced with something that neighbors would later describe as eerie, a tone out of place in the usual cadence of rural life. Within the hour they had vanished. No footprints leading beyond the tree line, no traces of struggle, just silence and a cold, damp morning where life had suddenly shifted. The town records preserved scant details. An entry in the sheriff's ledger mentions 3 juveniles unaccounted for, possible runaway. Yet neighbors remember the glances exchanged by adults, the hushed conversations. There was no question in anyone's mind. Something else had taken them. Decades later, these same records would become invaluable to scientists studying anomalies in the Appalachian region. Instruments measuring electromagnetic fields decades after the event recorded fluctuations at precise points in the forest where the sisters were last seen. Photographs uncovered in the attic of the family home, black and white and faded, showed the girls smiling. Shadows behind them seemed to stretch unnaturally, almost alive. Diaries written in delicate script described dreams where the mountains shifted, paths disappeared, voices carried on the wind, telling stories the sisters could not understand. Stories passed down by the local elders spoke of the children of the ridge spirits, said to roam the Blue Ridge, luring the curious into the forest, shadows flickering between trees, lights appearing without source, the whispers of those who had vanished before. The sisters were said to be fascinated by these tales, often exploring near the creek at dusk, listening to stories of travelers lost, of spectral figures, of rituals long forgotten. In hindsight, their curiosity seems to have led them towards something they were not meant to encounter. Witnesses decades later reported strange phenomena. Hikers, logging crews, and local residents described shimmering lights hovering above the treetops, sounds that resembled voices singing or crying. Instruments placed in the same areas decades later recorded energy anomalies, temperature drops, fluctuations in magnetic fields, patterns that science could describe but not fully explain. The fog that morning was unusually thick, rolling in slow and deliberate. Winds carried faint melodies, soft as a lullaby, yet discordant, unsettling, impossible to place. Every piece of evidence, from photographs, diaries, official records, to eyewitness accounts, paints a picture both haunting and perplexing. A tapestry woven of fear, curiosity, and inexplicable phenomena. Official investigation files, declassified after decades, reveal search parties combing the forest, dogs tracking scents that dissipated into thin air, officers reporting sudden chills, fleeting shadows, and a pervasive feeling of being watched, all meticulously documented yet yielding no resolution. The sisters' disappearance became the foundation of local folklore, stories of lights dancing on the ridges, children taken by the mountain spirits, warnings to stay away from certain paths after dusk, the forest itself becoming a character in the narrative, alive and unpredictable. Even today, the Blue Ridge holds memory. Moss patterns seem intentional, trees leaning in subtle directions, streams curving unnaturally. Instruments detect vibrations, a rhythm like a heartbeat not of human origin. The photographs, diaries, and official documents converge into a narrative that straddles reality and myth. Scientists analyzing energy patterns decades later found correlations between the disappearance and environmental anomalies, readings that suggest phenomena beyond conventional understanding. The weight of history, folklore, and scientific evidence presses down. The mountains are not silent. They remember, they protect, they hide. And the sisters, Essie, Bessie, and Dessie, remain absent, their story lingering like mist over the ridge, calling to those who would investigate, beckoning with whispers that promise understanding, yet threaten the unprepared. The first step into the story of the Blue Ridge disappearance is a step into uncertainty. A world where fact and legend merge, where science touches the edges of the impossible, where three sisters vanished and the mountains kept their secret for decades, until the scientists finally began to uncover the truth. March 1925. The Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia lay shrouded in early spring mist. The small town of Ravenswood nestled quietly among the ridges, unaware that it would become the backdrop for one of the most perplexing disappearances in Appalachian history. The three sisters, Essie, Bessie, and Dessie, were ordinary in appearance, yet somehow extraordinary in presence. Neighbors remembered them as bright, curious, and adventurous. They roamed the hillsides near their home, often returning with stories of strange sights, peculiar sounds, and the uncanny feeling of being observed. On that fateful morning, they set out with baskets in hand, crossing the creek that cut through the valley, their laughter mingling with the gentle babble of water. But something invisible awaited them among the ridges. Search parties were organized within hours, officers and townsfolk combing the forests, calling names, following trails. Yet no footprints, no traces, no signs of struggle could be found. The sisters had simply vanished. Official records from the time describe it as a singular disappearance with fate unknown. Entries in the sheriff's ledger note the town's alarm and the initial suspicions of runaway behavior. Yet neighbors remember the fear, the unspoken tension that spread through the community, the whispers of lights flickering unnaturally between the trees, shadows that seemed to move with purpose, and the animals restless barking and howling at nothing. Decades later, scientists studying the Appalachian region would examine photographs from the family home diaries discovered in dusty attics and declassified reports. The photographs depict the sisters smiling, but shadows behind them stretch unnaturally, almost alive. The diaries speak of dreams, where the mountains shifted, paths disappeared, voices called from the fog. Local folklore passed down through generations spoke of the children of the ridge. Spectral figures said to roam the Blue Ridge Mountains, spirits that lured the curious into the forest, taking those who ventured too far. Elders described lights floating in the valleys, appearing and disappearing without pattern, a phenomenon they called the wandering glow. Some claimed to hear laughter or crying on the wind voices with no source. The sisters' fascination with these tales may have drawn them unknowingly toward the unknown. Reports decades later note sightings of lights hovering in the treetops, instruments recording energy anomalies where the sisters were last seen, temperature fluctuations, and electromagnetic disturbances coinciding with locations mentioned in local legends. The environment that spring was unusually volatile. Cold snaps alternating with sudden warmth, fog lingering late into the morning. The microclimate of the ridges may have amplified natural phenomena. Yet even with meteorological data, the patterns defy explanation. The creek where the sisters were last seen curves sharply moss-covered rocks reflecting the morning sun in flickering patterns. Instruments decades later detected subtle vibrations, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, not of human origin. The forest itself seems aware. Trees leaning towards certain areas, branches swaying with no breeze, shadows stretching unnaturally across the terrain. The intersection of fact and folklore grows more pronounced. Eyewitness accounts, family journals, newspaper clippings, and official reports all contribute to a narrative that cannot be explained by logic alone. A local historian recalls interviews with residents who described animals reacting to unseen presences, dogs growling at empty spaces, birds flying erratically, the forest retaining memory, the mountains keeping secrets. The Blue Ridge Mountains became a character itself, alive, protective, and enigmatic. The sisters' disappearance is both a human tragedy and a supernatural enigma. As scientists comb through decades of data energy readings and archived materials, they uncover correlations between historical events, folklore, and unexplained phenomena. The electromagnetic anomalies, the energy spikes, the subtle shifts in temperature. Patterns repeating across decades, linking the disappearance to forces unrecognized by conventional science. The town's landscape, the ridges, the creeks, the forest floor, all seem to have been witnesses to an event that defied time. The mountains, dense with mist and shadow, hold on to the memory of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie, and their story is now intertwined with both legend and science. Each diary entry, each photograph, each official note adds texture to the story, The missing sisters, the spectral lights, the whispers on the wind, all coalesce into a narrative that is part history, part folklore, part something entirely beyond human comprehension. The Blue Ridge Mountains of 1925 are silent now, but the echoes of that spring morning linger, a fog-shrouded memory, the forest alive with secrets, waiting, until the scientists decades later began to piece together the evidence, and the story, slowly, painstakingly began to reveal truths that were at once terrifying and inexplicable. The investigation files from 1925 reveal a painstakingly detailed search undertaken by local authorities, officers, and volunteers who scoured the Blue Ridge Mountains from dawn until dusk. Official entries note repeated sweeps along the creek, the forest floor, and the hillsides where Essie, Bessie, and Dessie were last seen. Yet no trace was ever found. Footprints disappeared, as if swallowed by the earth. Personal items left behind were inexplicably intact: an abandoned basket, a shawl draped over a branch. Records indicate the sheriff's office received letters from concerned townsfolk describing strange lights in the valleys, glimmers that appeared only to vanish when approached. Officers noted sudden temperature drops and unexplained gusts of wind that carried distant, unintelligible whispers. In archived photographs, the sisters appear smiling, radiant, unaware of the looming mystery. Yet in the background, shadows distort unnaturally, bending in ways inconsistent with light sources. Analysts decades later described the images as containing anomalies that could not be explained by photography of the era. Journals recovered from the family home reveal entries where the sisters describe dreams of shifting landscapes, whispers in the forest, and visions of figures not of this world. One entry reads, "The trees moved while I slept, and the creek sang a song only I could hear." At the time, such writings were dismissed as childish imagination, but modern examination by scientists revealed that the locations described in the diaries correlate with areas of electromagnetic disturbances and unusual energy readings. Declassified reports from the National Weather Service and Appalachian Forestry units indicate that in March 1925, microclimates in the Blue Ridge exhibited anomalies, fog that persisted for hours, sudden temperature fluctuations, and air density changes unusual for that time of year. Contemporary scientists suggest these conditions may have contributed to the strange phenomena reported, though they cannot fully account for the sisters' disappearance. Further evidence comes from interviews conducted decades later with descendants of the search parties. Several recalled seeing fleeting lights between the ridges, describing them as orbs or glows hovering at treetop level. Some even reported hearing voices, laughter, or cries carried by the wind, seemingly responding to the presence of the investigators. The local newspaper from 1925, preserved in microfilm, contains reports of other inexplicable occurrences: animals behaving erratically, livestock missing briefly only to reappear unharmed, and hikers claiming to see shimmering figures at dusk. These reports at the time, considered minor oddities, now form a mosaic of the paranormal events surrounding the disappearance. Scientific analysis of the terrain decades later uncovered peculiar formations in the forest, depressions in the earth, moss-covered stones arranged unnaturally, and tree growth patterns suggestive of deliberate though unexplained alignment. Instruments measuring magnetic flux in the areas described by the diaries recorded spikes coinciding with locations of the reported lights and whispers. The convergence of multiple independent data points, official records, eyewitness accounts, photographs, diaries, and scientific readings paints a chilling picture that the Blue Ridge Mountains were not merely a setting, but an active participant in the disappearance. Further archival research revealed that 3 similar cases occurred in surrounding counties over the following decade, all sharing motifs of children disappearing near creeks and ridges, lights hovering in the forest, and whispers in the wind, patterns that modern investigators find too consistent to ignore. In addition to physical evidence, oral histories provide insight into the folklore that enveloped the sisters' story. Tales of the children of the ridge, spirits bound to the mountains, capable of luring the curious into the forest. Stories describing wandering lights that appeared just before a disappearance, a phenomenon documented in journals dating back to the 19th century. Such folklore may contain kernels of truth, embedded in centuries of observation, connecting human memory, environmental anomalies, and unexplainable occurrences into a single haunting narrative. Scientists examining energy patterns decades later compared the locations described in diaries and folklore with historical reports of anomalies. The electromagnetic spikes, temperature fluctuations, and microclimate irregularities overlapped in precise ways, a correlation too exact to dismiss. The sisters' disappearance, once treated as a missing persons case, now sits at the intersection of empirical observation and the unexplained. Photographs show shadows bending light, refracting strangely objects slightly displaced. Instruments detect low-level vibrations. The forest itself seems to hum as if aware of its history. These findings prompted further investigation. Teams of researchers mapping the Blue Ridge Mountains recorded recurring energy patterns, readings that align with both the folklore and documented accounts, suggesting a force or presence that has eluded conventional explanation. In reviewing all collected evidence, official files, diaries, photographs, witness interviews, and scientific readings, a portrait emerges, one that blends reality with legend. Human observation with natural anomaly, leaving the disappearance of Essie Bessie, and Dessie as a puzzle on the edge of comprehension. Each layer of evidence reinforces the others, creating a narrative that is both tangible and ineffable. The mountains, the forests, the creek, all part of an enduring mystery. A story of three sisters lost in space and time whose secrets continue to challenge scientists, historians, and those drawn to the Blue Ridge to this day. Decades after the disappearance, the stories of Essie Bessie and Dessie continued to ripple through Ravenswood. Grandchildren of those who lived through 1925 recounted tales overheard in kitchens whispered by candlelight, stories too frightening to speak aloud. One elderly resident remembered standing at the edge of the forest as a child, watching mist curl through the trees, hearing laughter high-pitched and fleeting, yet seeing nothing. She described the feeling as if the mountains themselves were breathing alive, waiting. Another witness, a retired logging worker, spoke of strange occurrences along the ridges decades after the sisters vanished. He recalled seeing lights hovering in clusters among the treetops, moving as if guided by unseen hands. Animals reacted violently to these phenomena. Dogs barking at empty spaces, horses trembling and refusing to move. He described the forest as having a memory, a consciousness, an awareness of intruders and trespassers. In interviews conducted by modern researchers, multiple families described children who had wandered into the forest only to return hours later, their eyes wide, unblinking, speaking of voices calling their names, shadows flitting just beyond sight. One young man, now elderly, recalled following a path along the creek where the sisters were last seen. He described an overwhelming sense of being observed, of someone or something following at a distance. The trees bending toward him, the wind carrying whispers that seemed to form words then dissolve. Local healers and folklorists suggested that the mountains were sacred, harboring spirits that protected certain paths and occasionally took those deemed curious beyond measure. The three sisters, by all accounts, fit that description. Families remembered their fascination with the folklore, how they lingered too long near the creek, how they peered into shadowed hollows, daring to call out names they had heard in whispers. Some accounts describe a figure seen fleetingly in the mist. Tall, ethereal, impossibly thin, moving silently between trees, observed by multiple witnesses over the years, always present near areas associated with the sisters, yet never caught. A neighbor recounted seeing the girls' reflections in the water, though no one else was present. The image shimmered, distorted, and then vanished. This witness was a child at the time, and decades later still described a lingering unease, a sense that the forest had marked the sisters, and anyone who looked too closely would be touched by that presence. In family diaries passed down, there are references to sudden illnesses, nightmares, and inexplicable behaviors in children who had visited the forest near the creek, dreams of lights dancing above the treetops, voices calling from nowhere. Some children refused to speak for days, as if overwhelmed by unseen forces. These personal experiences, layered atop official reports and folklore, suggest that the mountains were not simply a sitting, but an active participant in the story. The voices, the lights, the shadows, all became part of the human experience felt by those who remained. Researchers also documented more contemporary encounters, hiking groups reporting sudden temperature drops, inexplicable fog, and feelings of dread along the ridge. Cameras capturing orbs of light sensors recording anomalous electromagnetic activity. These readings correlated with historic accounts, photographs, and the precise locations mentioned in diaries. A former teacher recalled the day the sisters vanished. She remembered children walking into the mist, laughing, carrying baskets. Hours later, the air seemed heavier. The forest seemed still. She never saw them again. Her memory, decades later, remains vivid, her voice trembling as she recounts how she could almost hear whispers calling them back. Neighbors who attempted to follow sounds reported trails disappearing beneath their feet, stones shifting as if rearranged. Even seasoned hunters refused to continue, claiming a presence unseen but undeniable. The human scene, therefore, is one of tension, awe, and terror. Communities living in the Blue Ridge were shaped by this disappearance. Stories passed from generation to generation, warnings to children, tales by fireside conversations hushed in corners. Each narrative adds texture to the legend. Each account, fact, or interpretation amplifies the mystery. Personal experience meets the supernatural. Memory intertwines with folklore. The mountains themselves act as witnesses, recording the human reactions, the fear, the curiosity, the fascination. And in every human recounting, there is the sense of connection, a bridge between the sisters, the observers, and the landscape itself. Researchers examining these accounts describe a pattern, repeated motifs of lights, shadows, whispered voices, and inexplicable movements. Patterns mirroring the anomalies discovered decades later by scientific instruments. It becomes impossible to separate the human experience from the environmental and paranormal phenomena. Ravenswood became a community defined by its relationship with the mountains, the forest, the mysterious forces that may have claimed the sisters. The human scene is not merely anecdotal. It forms a bridge between empirical observation and folklore, emotion and data, reality and legend. Every testimony carries weight. Every recollection becomes evidence of the extraordinary. And yet, despite these accounts, the truth remains elusive. The sisters' presence lingers, in memory, in narrative, in the mountains themselves. Every retelling, every interview, every document contributes to an unfolding story, a human tapestry intertwined with supernatural threads. The Blue Ridge Mountains continue to guard their secrets, and the experiences of those who lived in proximity to the sisters' last known movements provide the deepest, most haunting insights into what really happened, who or what may have been present, and why these three sisters were never seen again. Decades after the sisters vanished, researchers finally began to piece together physical and documentary evidence. Scientific teams combing through archives and artifacts uncovered photographs taken by the sisters' parents, images capturing Essie, Bessie, and Desi in the forest, smiles radiant yet shadows behind them stretched unnaturally, elongated, bending against the light. Analysts noted distortions that suggested interference beyond the limitations of photographic techniques available in 1925. Instruments placed decades later in the Blue Ridge Mountains registered repeated anomalies in the precise locations depicted in these photographs. Spikes in electromagnetic activity, subtle temperature fluctuations, and unexplained energy readings, all coinciding with the sisters' last known positions. The sheriff's archives yielded reports previously overlooked. Handwritten logs, letters from townsfolk, and official communications describing fleeting lights in the woods, voices carried by the wind, and animals reacting violently to unseen presences. One entry mentions 3 small forms seen briefly among the trees, then gone. No trace of sound, smell, or movement. Initially dismissed as rumor, these records, when cross-referenced with scientific measurements, revealed a disturbing consistency. Diaries recovered from the family home contained chilling descriptions of experiences the sisters themselves had. Essie wrote of visions in the creek where water shimmered unnaturally, reflecting not just the mountains but shapes she could not name. Bessie noted whispers in the mist calling her by name and figures dancing along ridges just beyond sight. Desi described a light that followed her through the woods, bright yet intangible, and a feeling of being watched. Each entry, mundane at first glance, gains new weight when viewed through the lens of modern research. The intersection of these diaries with contemporary environmental studies shows a striking correlation. Areas described in their writings correspond to microclimate anomalies recorded decades later. Fog lingering longer than meteorology would predict. Temperature drops not explained by altitude or weather patterns. Unusual electromagnetic readings. Scientists also analyzed topography. The ridges, hollows, and creeks form natural conduits, creating pockets where energy readings consistently spiked. These locations matched the sisters' documented movements, suggesting either a natural phenomenon amplified by geography or forces entirely beyond conventional science. Witness testimony collected from descendants reinforced the picture. Elders recounted hearing faint laughter carried on the wind, observing lights flickering in the forest long after the sisters disappeared. One account described a shimmer above the creek at dusk, hovering, pulsing, then vanishing when approached, an effect observed by multiple unrelated witnesses over decades. In addition to environmental data, forensic studies of artifacts uncovered unusual markings, fibers, small objects, and footprints that defied conventional measurement. Impressions in soft soil that seemed to appear and disappear between observations. In parallel, local folklore repeatedly mentioned the children of the ridge spirits bound to the mountains taking the curious into the forest. The descriptions of these entities, light or shadow-like, often coincide with locations the sisters frequented. Scientists initially skeptical of folklore began noting correlations. The wandering lights described in oral histories matched energy anomalies, photographs, and diary entries, suggesting a pattern, a phenomenon interacting with human perception, environmental conditions, and documented evidence. Further corroboration comes from declassified meteorological data. March 1925 saw unusual early spring patterns, temperature inversions, dense fog lasting unusually long, and microclimate shifts creating pockets of humidity and cold. These conditions could explain visual distortions, shimmering lights, and auditory anomalies, yet the disappearances remain inexplicable. In 1935, 10 years later, reports of similar phenomena appeared in neighboring counties. Missing children, unexplained lights, and disturbances in the forest. Scientists later drew maps overlaying the 1925 disappearance with subsequent events. Patterns emerged, correlations in geography, timing, and environmental conditions, suggesting either a repeatable natural anomaly or something far more enigmatic. Modern instrumentation added another layer. Sensors detecting low-frequency vibrations, unexplained electromagnetic flux, and thermal irregularities were placed along the creek and ridge lines. Readings aligned with historic accounts, patterns repeating across decades. In examining the totality of evidence, photographs, diaries, official reports, environmental data, oral histories, and modern measurements, a portrait emerges, one that straddles the boundary of the known and the unknown. The Blue Ridge Mountains, with their shifting fog, steep ridges, and whispering forests, appear to have been an active participant in the sisters' disappearance. The convergence of fact and folklore, of human observation and empirical data, suggests a presence or force not fully comprehensible. Every artifact, every recorded anomaly, every witness account contributes to a growing narrative, a tapestry of mystery and terror. Scientists now assert that these patterns, corroborated over decades, provide the strongest evidence yet of a phenomenon that is simultaneously natural, cultural, and perhaps beyond the ordinary. The sisters' disappearance, once treated purely as a missing persons case, now sits at the intersection of historical record, environmental anomaly, and something the human mind struggles to classify. And yet, despite meticulous documentation, analysis, and repeated observation, the truth remains elusive. The forces at work in the Blue Ridge that spring of 1925, the energy fluctuations, the lights, the whispers, remain largely unexplained, leaving researchers and townspeople alike with questions, profound questions, about the sisters, the mountains, and the nature of reality itself. The culmination of decades of investigation, both scientific and folkloric, converges on the Blue Ridge Mountains, a region at once beautiful, serene, and deeply enigmatic. Researchers piece together patterns that spanned generations. Photographs, diaries, official records, energy readings, and oral histories, all pointing towards something beyond conventional explanation. The sisters Essie, Bessie, and Dessie were no longer merely missing persons. They became symbols of the unknown avatars of a mystery that defied comprehension. In examining energy anomalies, scientists discovered recurring spikes along the creek and ridges where the sisters had last been seen. Patterns repeating every spring, coinciding with folklore accounts of the children of the ridge, lights appearing without source, voices carried on the wind, and fleeting shadows moving against the natural flow of the forest. Analysis of photographs revealed subtle distortions in light and shadow, shapes bending unnaturally. Images of the sisters smiling, yet behind them shadows twisted as if aware of the observer. Scientists could not explain these anomalies using known physics. Electromagnetic fluctuations were real thermal readings inconsistent with weather data and magnetic disturbances concentrated in specific locations. The diaries once dismissed as childish fantasy now gain credence. Entries describing whispered voices, lights dancing along ridges, and reflections in the creek that did not correspond with reality. Cross-referencing these with modern measurements revealed a striking correlation. Every detail aligns. Every account corroborates another. The folklore long considered myth now appears almost prescient. The wandering lights, the protective spirits of the mountain. The warnings to the curious, these were not mere stories, but encoded observations of phenomena that persisted across decades. Interviews with local residents decades later add nuance. Hikers reporting unexplainable sensations, sudden chills, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Children recounting voices calling their names, shadows slipping just beyond perception. One retired logger described walking along the ridge and seeing a shimmer of light circular hovering at eye level. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath. He later learned that the location corresponded precisely to the creek where the sisters were last seen. Scientists, historians, and folklorists alike now consider the possibility that the Blue Ridge is a site of recurrent anomalous phenomena, a locus where natural conditions, electromagnetic activity, and human perception intersect, where the boundary between reality and the paranormal is thin. The payoff of this investigation is both profound and unsettling. Decades of data folklore and first-hand accounts suggest that the disappearance was not random, not merely a tragic accident, but the product of interactions between human curiosity and forces or phenomena beyond ordinary comprehension. Evidence points toward patterns, deliberate recurring aligned with geography, environmental conditions, and historical reports. The sisters' disappearance, rather than being isolated, is a node in a network of unexplained events spanning generations. Photographs taken decades later combined with energy readings and witness accounts suggest that these phenomena persist, that the mountains themselves may act as conduits or sentinels, observing, responding, and perhaps interacting with those who enter their domain. In folklore, the children of the ridge are said to appear to those deemed too inquisitive, lights leading the curious into the forest, never to return. Accounts from multiple generations corroborated by scientific observation suggest a disturbing convergence, a bridge between myth and empirical evidence. Between the documented energy anomalies and the spectral lights observed by residents, a pattern emerges, one that defies known science yet leaves tangible traces. The sisters' story is not merely historical, it is ongoing. The mountains continue to exhibit energy fluctuations, lights, shadows, and inexplicable environmental changes. Researchers working in the area report feelings of unease, instruments detecting subtle pulses, readings spiking in precise locations corresponding to diaries, photographs, and local legends. The ultimate revelation is haunting. Essie Bessie and Dessie are emblematic. Their disappearance reveals a phenomenon that exists at the intersection of human perception, environmental anomaly, and something beyond comprehension. The mountains hold memory, the forest retains traces of presence, and the convergence of fact, folklore, and science points to a reality that challenges understanding. The payoff, then, is not closure, but revelation. A recognition that the Blue Ridge Mountains were never silent. That the sisters' disappearance is a gateway into understanding forces, phenomena, and histories that exceed human expectation. The evidence, layered and corroborated, suggests the existence of patterns repeating across time and space. Interactions between energy perception and human curiosity, a mystery that is both deeply local and universally compelling. As the data accounts and folklore coalesce, a chilling picture emerges. The Blue Ridge Mountains are a sentinel, the sisters' disappearance a symptom, and the phenomena surrounding them both real and unfathomable. For those who study, those who walk the ridges, or simply hear the stories, the truth is clear. The mountains remember, and some secrets remain deliberately veiled, whispering to the attentive, warning the reckless and compelling the curious to look deeper. As the sun sets behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long shadows across the valleys and ridges, the story of Essie Bessie and Dessie lingers. The mist rolls in thicker now, curling around the pines like pale fingers of memory reaching across time. Decades have passed, yet the mountains remain unchanged. The creek still winds its secretive path, the ridges still hold the whispers of the lost, and the forest itself seems to breathe with a quiet, knowing presence. Scientists, historians, and locals alike continue to debate, to measure, to hypothesize, yet none can fully explain the convergence of events. The electromagnetic anomalies, the unusual thermal readings, the persistent lights hovering in the treetops, or the voices carried by the wind. Each piece of evidence, each story passed down through generations, forms a tapestry of mystery that defies resolution. There is no final report, no definitive conclusion. Only patterns, repeated across decades, motifs that link disappearances, sightings, and anomalous phenomena in a way that challenges human understanding. Folklore persists as both warning and guide. The children of the ridge, wandering lights, spirits that call to the curious. Stories shared by grandparents, whispered over fireplaces, recorded in diaries and letters, now corroborated by instruments, photographs, and modern scientific observation. The mountains remember. They have kept silent for generations, observing, recording, shaping the environment, and perhaps even interacting with those who enter their domain. The sisters' disappearance, far from being a singular tragedy, now stands as a symbol, a portal into the intersection of human perception, environmental anomaly, and phenomena that cannot be confined to rational explanation. For those who walk the trails, who peer into the misty hollows, who linger near the creek, the Blue Ridge whispers warnings, it offers glimpses, and it tests the courage and curiosity of all who enter. The unanswered questions multiply. What truly happened to Essie Bessie and Dessie? Are the lights simply an anomaly of nature, or is there a conscious presence guiding them? Do the mountains themselves hold agency, memory, or intent? Every measured reading, every oral account, every photograph hints at a truth partially obscured, one that cannot be entirely grasped, leaving the observer both fascinated and unsettled. And yet, in the absence of finality, there is a strange solace. The mystery endures. It connects past, present, and perhaps even future, inviting those willing to engage with it to explore the boundaries of reality, folklore, and human perception. The forest holds secrets, the mountains keep watch, and the sisters' story persists, woven into the very fabric of the land. Every whisper, every shadow, every light pulse becomes part of an ongoing narrative, a story that challenges assumptions, provokes thought, and captivates the imagination. As night falls, the Blue Ridge transforms. Fog thickens, obscuring paths, concealing the familiar. Sounds carry differently, voices echo strangely, and the atmosphere thickens with anticipation. It is here in these moments that the line between reality and legend blurs, and the presence of the sisters is felt most keenly, not as tangible forms, but as impressions, as lingering energies, a reminder of what has been lost and what continues beyond comprehension. The truth is never fully revealed, yet every account, every artifact, every recorded anomaly nudges us closer to understanding, and yet simultaneously the mountains guard their secret, whispering just beyond the edge of awareness. And so the story ends, not with closure, but with invitation, to remember, to wonder, to question, to imagine the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. Ravenswood, the Blue Ridge Mountains, the creek, the mist, the shadows all remain, silent witnesses to events that transcend time. The mountains keep their secrets, and the sisters' disappearance remains unsolved, waiting, perhaps for the next observer, the next seeker, the next curious soul who dares to step into the mist. You have witnessed another chapter in the ongoing saga of the Blue Ridge, a story where fact and folklore intertwine, where science meets the unexplained, and where three sisters vanished into legend. What you choose to believe is yours alone. But remember, the mountains remember too, and some secrets are patient enduring, waiting for those who will continue to look. You've just explored another enigma with Channel Name. Subscribe if you dare for more stories from the edge of reality, where the known ends and the unknown begins.